that I want us to talk about. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Practical Inclusion. I'm a little bit shaded on one side today. I've had a light malfunction. I'm also feeling a little out of sorts because I have to go and deliver something live in person this afternoon, which means I had to put pants on and shoes. And so this is going to be an interesting experience for me. I know my guest today is in a bit of a similar spot in terms of being back in the workplace, so we're going to chat about that. But before we do, I'd like to absolutely acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I get to have the privilege of delivering these sessions each week from, which is the land of the Wadawurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and a particular call out to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that are joining us today. Absolutely feel so privileged that you do listen in, and I know you do because I hear some comments, and also really keen for anybody who's listening who is Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nations of any country who wants to come on and share their story on this show. The platform is yours, so please reach out. I'd love to have you. Kait, can we talk about the country that you're on today?
Most certainly. So, Bree, I'm on Awabakal country, so Newcastle, traditional name being Mullumbimba, which is, place of the sea fern, which is really beautiful. I'm in the Newcastle CBD today, and I too would like to acknowledge, the elders past and present of the country which I'm coming from.
Beautiful, thank you. Now, Kait, I'm really looking forward to hearing your story, because as much as we've talked and we've had some sessions together, and I've been following your work and the amazing. If you're not following Kait on LinkedIn, do it now, because there's almost daily there's brilliant shares that you're making, Kait. And I've just had my first interruption by a sick school child, and we haven't had an interruption on live before, so it's about time, right? Yes, Sky? Where's the scissors? Oh, you can find the scissors later, all right? I'll be there soon. All right. Yeah, you can watch YouTube, do it, why not? It's free reign, empty the pantry, go for it. So, Kait, I'd love to hear about your story. Usually we ask people to share your story and give us an idea of why you're doing work in diversity and inclusion, why it's important to you, what's brought you here, and really anything you want to share with the audience today.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Bree. So I did a lot of English and humanities type subjects at school, loved society and culture, 4-unit English, all of that kind of great stuff. I finished school. I knew I wanted to work with community in some capacity. I didn't know what that looked like. A few mates and I started a Facebook group called Queer Babes of Newcastle, in 2013, really back in the day. And, a bit of community advocacy type stuff really started from there. So when I went to university the first time, I did an undergraduate degree in queer literature and Aboriginal studies. I knew that they were my two real big focus areas or areas of passion. I just didn't know what that would mean practically. So anyone that doesn't know what their studies mean practically, they go on to do an honours thesis. So my honours thesis was on Tumblr was really big at the time, and there was a lot of queer poetry and literary discourse happening on that space, and my poetry collection, I suppose, was in response to a lot of that queerness that was happening online. And then from there, I finished, and I really enjoyed the experience. A few of my lecturers, really liked what I was putting out. Had the opportunity to publish a book and speak at Mardi Gras and a heap of really cool events over the years. Get published in Archer magazine and Queer Stories with May Marvin, some really cool stuff. But I quickly realised that there's probably one or two poets in Australia that are paid full time and exist just as poets. So I worked out pretty quickly that to get by, I needed to seek out some more meaningful employment. So I applied for a role in a contact centre in the health sector. And from there have, had the opportunity to move through the organisation. So I started, helping, our clients, members. Then I moved into, more of a knowledge management learning space. So I had my first taste or introduction, if you like, to accessible learning resources. I had no idea that white space on a page, spacing things out, WCAG guidelines, for folk that might be using a screen reader or, have need vision assistance, that, learning resources wouldn't be accessible to them. Had no idea. So that was my first sort of professional foray into creating inclusive learning materials. And then from there, I got quite vocal in our, different LGBTQIA plus spaces that were emerging at work. And I got noticed by our human resources department as someone that could, make some more tangible change. They gave me an opportunity, a little secondment, and I've been here ever since. It'll be 12 months in September. So I've been really enjoying the work that I get the opportunity to do, in the sector that I'm in, the organisation I work for. It's a fresh new area to be exploring. But off the back of that early study where it was quite introspective, doing that poetry work, I realised that I wanted to assist the community in more tangible ways. So I've gone back to school. I'm studying public health with a community focus, same queer focus, same First Nations health equity focus. But it's been really nice to channel those passions into something that I feel like will hopefully one day really give back to folk.
Oh, amazing. And you're doing stuff to give back now, currently. I know the stuff that you're doing, and it's incredible. There's a few things I wanted to pick out there. Particularly, there's a lot of people who come to me regularly wanting to get into the diversity and inclusion space and not knowing quite how to. That the career journey that you've painted there, the picture that you've painted there of getting that in an organisation and kind of working your way into a diversity role is so common. For those who are currently sitting in their organisation and they see that potentially there's an opportunity to advocate for a role around diversity and inclusion, what kind of advice would you give them? How do you kind of get the organisation to really take this seriously?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of workplaces use Workplace or Slack or some of those intercommunication type tools. If your org uses that, or old school Jabber, or whatever the different communication tools that you use, start up a Pride resource group, or connect with if you're a First Nations person and you want to have a space that's carved out to talk with community about culture or workplace concerns or accessibility, whatever your sort of area of maybe historical underrepresentation is, or diversity marker, if you like. I think that a lot of the groundswell activities, particularly my org and a lot of different orgs, really does need to be employee led, and from those really organic groups popping up at work, that's when the journey's really started. And I don't think that experience is uncommon. But if you've got the tool to carve out even a tiny little space, it might start with 5 folk, you might have an influx of people. I know that one of our accessibility groups was some of our user experience designers were really passionate about some of those accessible learning pieces that I spoke to before. And from there, that group was forged really organically. I think sometimes with employee resource groups, across different sectors and industries, there's a lot of imposed formality onto folk. And sometimes those groups can be very measured. And of course, having that senior leadership and executive backing is so important to progress initiatives no matter where you are. But I think that, starting from the folk that really care and have that empathy and passion for that particular cause, it's eventually going to be noticed by folk that might, have the means to make more formal decisions about your D&I journey.
Yeah, that's great advice. It makes a lot of sense as well. Now, I want to jump onto some of the topics that we were just talking about briefly beforehand. And one of the things was this, this position we've both found ourselves in. You're in a much more extreme case than mine. You have actually gone back into the workplace for the first time today.
Yeah, that's right.
COVID. Can you talk a little bit to, your personal experience with that, but also what you see as challenges for our trans and gender diverse community with this move back into the workplace?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm very lucky. The employer that I work for, has completely embraced and adopted flex ongoing. But we do, of course, like many orgs, realise that there is that need for intermittent social connection, whether that be to have a lunch or to do some brainstorming, strategy days, whatever that potentially looks like for your workplace. But I think the thing that I've been really conscious of, Bree, is that when you have the opportunity to meet with folk on Zoom, it's a great equalizer that being online, virtually connecting, some of the markers that might be apparent for someone who's gender diverse, that might, quote unquote, clock someone as being, a member of our community. A lot of those different aspects are dissolved, and I'm thinking about things like, the presence of breasts or facial hair or some of those little markers that people previously may have, used to identify members of our community. A lot of that's absorbed over Zoom. You would never know. People have got really creative backgrounds. I guess it's the 3D nature of who we are, taking up space, being quite present, is very different in person. And, we talked to before, I normally throw a plain grey t-shirt on and some like Adidas exercise shorts, and I'm like at my desk ready to go for the day. Whereas in the office, even if you're someone who maybe, fashion isn't your first love, or, aesthetic dressing is not like really where you're at, you start to notice that it's like, oh, is that the right shirt? Have I ironed that in a way that, looks smart? I wear foundation when I go out into public in the office, which, a lot of trans masc folk probably don't, but I have quite severe rosacea. So there's little things that I think about that I don't do at home. Once we go out in public, and I don't think that's workplace specific. I think that's existing as a queer or LGBTQIA plus person in general. There's some things that we probably consider more than perhaps someone who isn't part of the community that might be self-conscious about the space that they occupy.
Yeah. And I know I hate that we always, when we talk about trans and gender diverse issues, we always talk about bathrooms, but I still think there's a point to remind workplaces that's also something that perhaps, the world has moved a lot in the last 2 years. And there is this expectation now, I think, and I'm certainly seeing with the organisations that I work with and from their employees and from students and people that our businesses interact with, that there is that expectation that we do provide inclusive, safe, supportive spaces. And there may have been some organisations that have forgotten that. And bathrooms, I think, is one of them. And there's probably a range of other logistical issues too that people need to think more closely about when it comes to the trans and gender diverse staff re-entering the workplace or entering the workplace for the first time, because there's been a lot of recruitment over the last 2 years too.
Oh, absolutely. Seeing people that, were previously enabled on screen in 3D, like, and if folk, might not want to offer their pronouns on Zoom for whatever reason, if they're not comfortable or figuring it out, or like whatever their situation may be, we are I'm trying to remember to introduce myself with my pronouns so that other folk feel really comfortable to share theirs. But I think the bathroom piece is interesting. I've seen a little bit of discourse, and I think that now that everyone's been using gender neutral bathrooms in their home for the past, 18 months to 2 years, I think what it's meant for orgs that may not have had, a more appropriate or better toilet situation for our community has really got them thinking of like, oh, wow, well, my partner and child who are all different genders to me, we're all using the same bathroom, or my housemate, or whatever your living situation may look like, or if it's just you, obviously it's an all gender toilet because you're using it in the safety of your home. So yeah, I think it's easier in some ways to have that conversation with people because they've realized, oh, I never really had to think about it because at home that's the way it is. And I mean, it seems really silly that they're separated, but then, on the same token too, with people that have experienced, certain, vulnerable situations at work or whatever, that separation has probably been historically really important. And I always think about that too, because, gender equity is all genders, of course, not just our community. So thinking about sometimes that separation exists for safety purposes too, but we just need to make sure we've got that alternative as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a good point. And I really think there is a great opportunity here for workplaces to really think about the inclusivity or not inclusive nature of their existing workplaces and how they can improve things. Following on from that, we're talking a little bit about Christmas parties. Can you tell me what maybe are some of the things that organisations should be watching for when it comes to inclusion around, the social events, that because people are ready and raring to as you say, have that social interaction. But how do we make sure that those events are still inclusive, particularly of our community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think being cognizant of what dress code you put on an event is a really great first start. Thinking about that, if you're a trans or gender or diverse person, particularly if you maybe a really slender person or like a large person, getting clothes that fit off the rack can be a really big challenge for people. And what I mean by that is that particularly if there's someone who might have the body type that aligns with the gender that they were presumed at birth, the clothing that they pick is probably going to be a really big challenge. So if they haven't sort of figured that out, or they're particularly at the early stages of their social transition or social expression of who they are, it can be really, really difficult and often quite expensive. I know the particular men's first that I love, I get a lot of great shirts from them. Johnny Big, shout out, like they're great. But until you really find your niche, I think, Bree, it's funny, I think all queer people have a uniform. We know what we like and what works, and we'll gravitate towards that and probably buy that particular item in 20 colours because we know that it's just absolutely a no-brainer. Yeah, I've got 10 of these shirts in all different neutral tones. They work, I feel great in them, and it's just a step in the morning that I don't really need to think about. So circling back that keeping it at smart casual, or if you're having a theme, for instance, like whatever your end of year festivities are, like consider like is someone who might not fit in a binary gender category going to be able to really make that theme work for them in a way that's really comfy. If we think about things like different shirts or whatever. Another thing that I think is really important to think about is when you pick your venues, a lot of quite upscale establishments or places that might be considered quite opulent, for lack of a better word, if you're someone who works for a big org or a consulting firm or whatever, they haven't always been historically welcoming to queer communities. There's that element of classism, obviously, where financially, economically, employment underrepresented in so many spaces. So if you're picking somewhere that's going to make someone really question what piece of cutlery they're going to use or how they fit in, I think that's a really good call for all folk, irrespective of their, diversity marker. There's spaces that weren't traditionally for us. So making sure that, there's that safety as well. The two ones, dress code, excuse me, and venue.
I would totally agree. And of course, there's a whole raft of, excellent resources on the internet. You type in inclusive events, inclusive events guide, something along those terms, and you'll get a whole bunch of tips about how you can make that end of year function as inclusive as possible, and remembering to think well past, gender and sexuality, cultural diversity, particularly things around alcohol can be really challenging for a number of groups of people, and how you balance that. I can totally relate to the venue choice and the dress codes. It can petrify me at times how that venue is going to expect me to present or wear, or show up as in that space, and how you are going to get misgendered, and all the things that go in your mind when an event's set, which can just add, complexity to something that should be a relaxing, fun catch up after a difficult time where we haven't had these social interactions. So really putting that work in at the start is so incredibly important that we get that right. So I'd certainly agree with all of that. Can you talk a little bit towards trans inclusion in the workplace in terms of policies? I know we are getting there with many organisations in terms of the number of organisations that now have affirmation policies. Some are even having transition or affirmation leave for employees. What do you see, I guess, maybe two questions here. What's the best practice example, the thing that you think organisations should really push for when it comes to trans and gender diverse inclusion in policy? And the second would be, what's the easy thing they can do today?
Yeah, it's a great one. And I think that there has been a really big cultural shift towards what policies look like and what they contain. But I think where the conversation has potentially lacked is the interpretation of those policies. It's fine for your Rem and BEM, department, or your diversity and inclusion team, or, whoever's setting up your people policies, if they're really well read and researched and they are aligning with other orgs that are seen to be leaders in this space, that's great. But if that policy then can't be interpreted by every single person in your organisation, or there's a lack of cultural competency in how you discuss the elements of that policy, I'm not really interested in it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that policies are so important. They give a formal framework, but if then you're presenting that to someone who, is potentially using really wildly outdated language, or is still, making assumptions or asking questions that are quite invasive, it's rubbish. It doesn't, it might have some great benefits listed, but it's not really going to hit the mark. From a personal anecdote point of view, I recently got a date for my gender affirming surgery, which is like wonderful, taking place next year. I told my boss about it. My boss puts a catch up at a local cafe to talk about what those next steps could be. So for me, that gesture of wanting to, have a meal, catch up, understand more is so much more valid than anything that's written on a document that's stored in a file that people pull out usually when something's gone awry. Like, let's be honest, that's what policies and governance frameworks and orgs are for, to work through those issues. But, I don't think that you can articulate in a policy, take your employee for a heartfelt breakfast. Like, that's never going to work. But her initiative in, knowing that somewhere away from the office, a neutral space, like, that was just really kind. And I will, irrespective of what orgs have got, documented, it really comes down to individual leaders within businesses to think about how they want to approach it with, their, trans and gender diverse reports.
Yeah, that's such great context for people to keep that in mind, and I'm going to take that straight into the session that I'm delivering this afternoon on LGBTI inclusion in schools, because you're 100% correct. You can have all the best policies in place, and I learnt that very clearly in a previous organisation that I was working with, where there was absolutely the best policies in place, and even leadership was fantastically on the right path and talking the right language. But when it came down to the actual on-the-ground experience of staff with their direct line managers or with their colleagues, it wasn't filtering through in any way, shape or form. And I think that's so important to make sure we remember that work is not, we don't just put a policy in place and it's done. It's, do people know that exists? Do they understand what that means? And as you say, can they relate on a personal level to issues that are very personal? And do they have the skills and the empathy to be able to have those conversations? And that's such a beautiful story you've shared there of how to do it well. We're kind of coming to the end of our time, unfortunately, because I would love to keep chatting with you, Kait, as always. I really thank you for coming on today and sharing your personal story, and also on a day when, your first day back in the workplace. So I know that your time is precious today. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. Is LinkedIn the best place for people to find out more about you or connect with you?
Yeah, most welcome to connect. I'm, always commenting on Bree's content, and there's so much fantastic stuff out there. And I think it all comes back to, the better we all go, the better we all go. And I think that, with policies and bathrooms and all of these big structures that can be really scary for orgs to navigate, it's one thing for them not to be in place, but it is all about the conversations that surround them. you don't have an accessible toilet right now. Great. What are your plans to move forward with that, or what are the alternatives in the meantime? Because the result of COVID-19 is a lot of orgs, economically, when they think about how they're going to fit out their spaces, it can be really challenging because who's going to rock up, who's not going to rock up, are people going to really enjoy that face to face? And there are a lot of choices that need to be made, but if there's a time where there's a bit of a layover between making some of those changes, there's so many things that you can do in terms of the language and the way that you talk about these things that are opportunities in the meantime, that's going to make your staff feel innately more included.
Yeah, no, great points. There is plenty of things that people can do, and that's a good reminder. And thanks, Rosie, for joining in, and for I'm glad that you took something out of today's session. Now, before we go, I do want to say, exciting times. I do have a new website, same address as always, breegorman.com.au. And I also have a new logo, which is not up there on the screen yet today, but I will slowly get my way through changing all the logos over. And the reason I'm kind of mentioning this is because it really has been almost exactly 2 years now, I think. No, a year and a half, I don't know. Anyway, it's the end of 2021, and I feel like at this point in time, launching a new website, new logo, the business is settled. And for any of you who do considering going out and starting your own business or have done, the path at the start is a little bit rocky. There's no doubt about it, especially when you launch a business just before a pandemic starts. But it's worth it, and certainly worth it for me. And I really want to put a big call out to all of those who have supported my business throughout all this time. It feels like a big step change now, working into next year, that this is not just a thing that I'm playing at to see if it works. This does work, and will continue into the future. So I just want to put a huge call out to people like yourself, Kate, and others who have just really supported me since I've started, and I know will continue to support me going onwards, and particularly the clients that are now ongoing clients that have made this all possible. So a big shout out and a big thank you, and check out the new website and give me your thoughts and opinions, and tell me if you notice any mistakes. I'd love that too. It's good timing because the dog's just losing its marbles. The kid's wanting more breakfast. I think she's up to 3rd breakfast this morning. And so we'll tune out. Thanks again, Kate, for coming on. And we will catch everybody next week.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Bree. Bye, everyone.
Pleasure. Bye.